Well, good morning to colleagues in the UK and good evening to colleagues in Australia. And thank you very much for joining this, the first in our series of 3 online events which are focusing on cybersecurity in space. My name is Tim Pinchin and I'm Head of Communications at the Satellite Applications Catapult in Harwell. And we're really pleased to be running these workshops in partnership with the British High Commission to Australia. We very much enjoyed working together to put these sessions together, and I'm looking forward to watching them unfold over the next 3 days. It really goes to show what can be achieved with great collaboration, even with 10,000 miles between us. For those of you who don't already know about the Satellite Applications Catapult, we're an independent research and technology organisation in the UK, founded in 2013, and we're here to support the growth of the UK space sector and to innovate for a better world empowered by satellites. This series of workshops are a really exciting opportunity to encourage Australian UK business engagement and awareness in cybersecurity. And over the course of the 3 events, we're going to be joined by experts in the field who are going to talk to you about their ideas and be able to answer your questions. And I really encourage everyone who's listening to take full advantage of this opportunity to collaborate and to ask questions and to really engage in the sessions and in the online networking session, which will follow the final workshop on Wednesday. That's it from me. But without further ado, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Steph Lysaght, Consul General for Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, who will now extend his welcome to you all and open today's session. So over to you, Steph.
Thanks very much, Tim. And can I just start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land for us here in Australia, pay my respects to those generations past, present and future. It's great to be a part of this. It's particularly great for me because I'm new, so I'm going to be learning huge amounts. I'd like to say thank you to all of the speakers who's going to be taking part over the next 3 days, for all the people that are tuning in, and in particular to you, Tim, and colleagues at the Satellite Applications Catapult. The main aim, I think, for me and for others, is to try and learn a bit more about the nexus between space and cybersecurity. We hear a lot about cybersecurity, we hear a lot about space, but we don't always hear the 2 things together. And obviously it's hugely important that we bring this together. We understand our security concerns, we understand how we can collaborate and partner, but we also understand the commercial opportunities that will arise as well. The commercial opportunities, I think, are going to be very significant. If to use just a couple of examples, the UK is looking to create 100,000 jobs by 2030 in the space sector. Here in Australia, the Australian government is hoping to treble its space sector by 2030. So not only is this a huge security priority for us, it's a huge prosperity priority for everyone too. In our Department of International Trade networks all around the globe, we've got experts that can help UK companies navigate this sector, whether it's here in Australia helping UK companies export or come and set up here, or Australian companies that wish to move to the UK. So in summary, a big thank you for everyone taking part. I think we all share, everyone on the line, we share the same challenge. We have institutions which are well aligned to collaborate together, and we have a really strong desire for our companies to get involved and to grow the sector and the markets. So thank you again for everybody that's joining us today. Without further ado, let me pass you back to Tim. Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steph. It's really great to have you here this morning. Thank you for that opening. That's wonderful. I'd now hand over to David Livingstone. David Livingstone is Director at Napier Meridian, and he'll be facilitating the session today. David's a cybersecurity expert who's based in the UK. And we have great pleasure. We'll have the great pleasure of hearing him speak at the session tomorrow as well. But for today, David will be facilitating this session. So over to you, David. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim, and welcome to everyone, both in Australia and the United Kingdom. So it's a series of three workshops, but really the purpose of today is essentially to set the picture. And I've got 2 fantastic speakers, and we will not delay any further. I'd like to introduce now, please, Dr. Patricia Lewis, who's the Director of the International Security Department at Chatham House. Patricia is the Research Director for Conflict, Science and Transformation, and the Director of the International Security Programme. Former roles including Deputy Director of Science in Residence at the Centre for Non-Proliferation Studies and the Monterey Institute, and Director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, and Director of Vertic. Patricia, for the UK aspects, to sort of set the picture, what's the problem with this space and cybersecurity gig, please?
Thank you very much indeed, David. I'm going to share some slides, which I hope will work. Is that working? Yes, just give me a nod.
Yep, that's on the screen. You just need to go to slideshow. There we go. Fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, David. So my job is to sort of set the scene, talk about how significant and important this issue is. And of course, I'm sure everybody here understands very well how much of our critical infrastructure worldwide depends on the space infrastructure. Space platforms are digital information conduits, and as such, they are attractive targets for cyber attack. If you think about space as one big digital platform, that is perhaps the best way to think about it. It's gathering information from the planet, it's gathering information from space, and all of that information is coming back to us through signals transmission and is primarily digital information. So if we look at the sort of things that space is really important for, of course, perhaps the primary one that springs to mind is position, navigational and timing data. And of course, this is well known to us as GPS. And now, of course, we have Galileo, and there are various other networks around the world as well that gather this information for us. We are so highly dependent on this information, particularly the timing signals for electronics functioning, for all of our date stamping and time stamping for financial transactions. We are really important on, obviously, on that data, the positional, navigational data for so much of our transportation infrastructure. We are also, though, I think it's important to note that we are dependent on it for our environmental monitoring, our weather monitoring, all of our communications, all of our broadcast. And I think what we must remember when we're talking about the space infrastructure, that we also mean all the ground stations and all the analysis that occurs on the ground. That should be seen as part and parcel of this one big digital infrastructure. They are the cyber vulnerabilities that exist in the space infrastructure. Some of them are legacy, some of them are newly imported. And of course, you know, because of the distance, because of the cost of putting our satellites up, one of the big problems is if we have to do sort of retrofitting, which is always a problem in cybersecurity anyway, but of course is made doubly difficult. We have a bigger problem, I think, in that the risks aren't fully understood in the critical infrastructure sector. Certainly the research that we've been carrying out across the world. The dependencies may be quite well understood in some sectors, obviously some better than others. But I think where we're seeing big lack of understanding is the cross dependencies. So you may think you've got all of your dependencies down in your sector, but when it comes to cross dependencies, particularly in the supply chain, these are often poorly understood within and across the CNI sectors. And I think we need to look specifically also at the military side of things. The militaries have always depended since the 1950s and 60s heavily on satellite technologies for intelligence gathering, and increasingly so for all sorts of other activities: navigation, targeting, communications, command and control, and again, environmental monitoring is terribly important. And so cyber vulnerabilities in that sector are also a major concern. And I think one of the things going forward that we're all looking at, and I think we've had a big wake-up call with COVID-19, is the aspect of resilience. So we can look at the cyber complexity across all of these sectors. We can look at all of the data gathering and how to manage data, how to secure data. But we have to not only look at that, but also look at the resilience we have for if that data doesn't deliver, or if that data is in some ways manipulated. And this resilience, I think, will not only help us in terms of backup, but would also help us in terms of verification and authentication. So analyzing this intersection between cybersecurity and space security is absolutely essential to understand the evolving security threat. And as I said in the previous slide, going wider, we have, of course, the whole of the CNI, on which also our military depends. So it seems to us that the critical issue is information integrity. And this is a problem that goes way beyond this particular presentation. Some of it you will know is how to deal with fake news, but fake news in our data sets is a really difficult one. And it's an age-old problem. This is not a new problem. It's been there ever since time immemorial. How can we be sure that the information we receive is the information we were sent and we were meant to receive? This is a really important thing. And of course, we can't always be sure in any realm. But how can we be sure or how can we increase our certainty in the realm of cybersecurity and space security? So when we look at the old-fashioned ways of intercepting signals, we have the jamming of signals. And I don't want you to be confused between the jamming of signals and cyber interference. There's some interesting parallels, but they're not the same thing. So when we have jamming of signals, we know about it, right? Signals jammed. And it's annoying. And it's certainly a threat, but we know when it occurs, and knowledge is everything in this game. When we have spoofing, where you have an intercepted signal that's replaced with a false signal, that's also a real pain. But we have now authentication and verification measures which help us work out when this has happened. And so while this is very annoying, it is less of a threat. Cyber interference, however, where the information contained within the signal, the digital information, is manipulated and spoofed, it's a much larger threat. And we've seen many instances now of attempts and actual somewhat experimental successes in being able to do this, is to provide the wrong information to the system at hand, so say a ship, to send it in the wrong direction, for example. We can see how wrong information, for example, about weather, could be a major factor in deciding about shipping, could be a major factor in any military maneuvers, and so on. We can see various attempts throughout the whole of the space system to see what the possibilities are. And my guess is that this is just the beginning. So what to do about it? Well, we have new approaches now in multilateralism. Certainly the UK and Australia are leading a move in the United Nations towards responsible behavior in space and in cyberspace. Two separate maneuvers, if you like. The cyberspace responsibility is older, and it's quite entrenched. I say older is a few years, but it's become quite entrenched in terms of those that want to control cyberspace for their citizens, China, Russia, and so on, and those that want to free up cyberspace for their citizens, the West particularly, and at the same time provide security for their citizens. That doesn't mean that the state is controlling them. And this is an extremely difficult thing. And it's very much a philosophical approach to how we think about our societies and how we think about our connectivity. So this is now where the rubber hits the road in international relations in the United Nations, but also in the OSCE, also in various regional bodies, a different view of how we treat information. But we're going ahead. The UK put down a new resolution this autumn on responsible behaviour in space, focusing on norms, rules and principles. This is to break a deadlock in terms of any progress on controlling military and aggressive behavior in space. We also need, though, I think, in addition to this state approach, a multi-stakeholder collaboration in developing sectoral responses. We all need to be on board here. We all need to understand each other. Industry needs to understand government. Government needs to really understand what industry is worried about and can deliver. And the general population needs to be involved in this, because this is a real issue of human security, and it has something in it for everybody. So we all need to be talking to each other and working together and singing off the same song sheet. We need to identify supply chain commonalities for space-based assets, and also within our critical national infrastructure. And then I suppose the other thing is that, do we see space as something that interacts with the CNI, or is it part of the CNI? Now, I know that space is very much an international critical infrastructure, but many of us are using it as part of our national infrastructure. And particularly where we have our own satellites, or we have shares and satellites together, I think it might be useful for us to start thinking about this as part and parcel of the CNI, and creating a sector of space in the CNI. Certainly, if you look at what NATO has done recently in incorporating space as a domain, after all these years of space being available, if you like, for NATO and being fundamental to NATO's command and control systems, incorporating space as a domain now is a really important step. And I think the other thing is to focus on resilience, rather than try to think about every problem as a problem needing to be fixed, which is great. That is a fool's errand in a way. We can never fix every problem. We can never be ahead of every problem all of the time. But what we can do is incorporate resilience, and we're calling it resilience as deterrence. So it's deterrence by denial, essentially. So if you increase your resilience, you are no longer as attractive a target. So if every person in the population is vaccinated against smallpox, smallpox can't be weaponized. It's the same principle. If we have enough resilience in our space infrastructure, in our cyber infrastructure, we are no longer so attractive as a target. So we deny that threat. And then I think as part of going forward, what we need to do is look to new technologies. We already know how AI can really help in cybersecurity, and that's certainly the case in space. But we have new technologies, fast coming on stream, such as quantum communications and so on, that we can look to for longer term solutions. Chatham House has been working on cybersecurity for over a decade. The space and cybersecurity we began in 2012. As something then that I don't think any other policy think tanks were considering. We know the military were very concerned with it at the time, and most of our sources then came from the military. Now, of course, it's much broader, it's much more embedded in the thinking of cybersecurity experts and space experts. And here are some of the publications that we put out that I'm happy to share with you as going forward in our discussion. Thank you.
Patricia, thank you very much indeed for that fantastic start. If you could, there we go, stop screen sharing and all that kind of stuff. There are a couple of points which we might come back to in the Q&A, just on that, particularly about cross dependencies and the analysis required by people to establish their true, cyber exposure. However, we'll leave that for a second. Do keep your Q&A. I can see the Q&A is already beginning to build up, which is fantastic. I'd now like to introduce Rajiv Shah, please, Managing Director of MDR Security and Fellow of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's been working in cyber intelligence and security business for over 20 years. He's a PhD in quantum physics. Retains a keen interest in mathematics and science. So this intersection of space and cybersecurity, he says, is an area he is very passionate about. Rajiv. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Rajiv.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, thank you for the invitation to talk to you today, and thank you everyone who's joined us. As David said, I'm actually really excited to talk about this topic. I studied physics. I did an undergraduate project on astrophysics. I did a PhD in quantum physics. And then I got into IT and into cybersecurity. And a few years ago, I used to talk to me about how you could do a PhD that taught you lots of useful things, but you never actually used it in your job. But that's all changing now. So I'm really glad actually now to have the opportunity to come back to some of my roots around this. So I was asked to give you some thoughts in terms of setting the background. Obviously, I'll take it from Australian perspective, but space and cybersecurity don't really respect borders. So there'll be some repetition of what Patricia said, but hopefully you'll find it useful and interesting. So I was just going to share some slides with you. Okay, so being asked to set the scene for you. And so I was going to talk about firstly about space in Australia, then talk about cybersecurity in Australia, and then talk a bit more about the cyber risks involved in space, start to talk about some of the solutions and things we need to think about, and just sum up with some conclusions and some thoughts to take away, and maybe lead us into some interesting Q&A. So space in Australia. Well, actually, space has always been important to Australia. The Parkes telescope and the Tidbinbilla telescope and the Honey Creek played a very proud role in the moon landings. Those pictures that came of Neil Armstrong taking his first steps on the moon would not have been possible without the telescopes here in Australia to receive the signals and then beam them around the world. And as a country with large open spaces and remote locations, we rely a lot on space even today. So satellite communications are key for a number of people who live a long way from large cities. Our national broadband network relies on satellite coverage for what's about 2% of the population, but I suspect a much larger portion of the landmass. And with large open areas, agricultural business, machinery, mining, those sort of things. Things like positioning technology, so you know where on earth you are when you're out in the middle of nowhere, and things like applications like sensing and observations in order to be able to not have to go and travel physically to a location to go and inspect things, have been really important to Australian industry and Australian society. So Australia has a sort of long, proud history of space. But if you look at it, for much of that time, you would say actually Australia has been a consumer of space. It uses all these technologies, it incorporates into society, but hasn't really been a producer. However, that's all changed in the last few years. So a few years ago, the government made a very bold decision that we're going to have a civil space sector here in Australia. And it wasn't just empty words, they took concrete actions to put that into practice. So they established the Australian Space Agency, and as part of that, it has a 10-year strategy to grow that. And I'm sort of showing a small diagram there, but I'd recommend to you, if you're interested, to go and have a look at the Australian Space Agency website and their strategy. They have some very good ideas and some priorities they're setting in order to build that industry for us here. And this is because this is recognised as an economic opportunity. Australia is a very technologically advanced nation, a well-educated nation, and one that actually punches above its weight in terms of its size when it comes to technology. And therefore, space is a great opportunity for us as a nation. One thing I will pull out from that strategy, if you go and look at it, is it actually pulls out one of the key pillars of enabling an effective space industry in Australia is regulation, risk, and culture. And part of that is cyber regulation. And I'll come back and touch on that later. But that's actually a really important thing about trying to understand the landscape here and where we need to go. So as well as the civil space sector, we're also seeing defence starting to ramp up in the space sector here in Australia. So earlier this year, there was a Defence Strategic Update that was issued, and that recognised space actually as a fifth domain. And for those of you that are counting, there's air, maritime, and land as the traditional 3 military domains, and then explicitly added cyber and space as the additional 2 domains, so very relevant to our conversation today. And of course, what was said there, and we're aware, space is a contested domain, and that becomes relevant when we look at security of that. So as well as that sort of general strategic recognition of the importance of space as a contested domain, defence here is also gearing up for some major projects. For those of you familiar with these sort of acronyms and things, there's a project known as JP9102, which is a multi-billion-dollar project to establish a sovereign satellite communications network for the Australian Defence Force. And a number of other defence projects going on focused around trying to develop sovereign capabilities relevant to space. And the third thing actually is sort of talk about, satellites traditionally been, large, expensive things to launch and manage. What we've seen in recent years is the advent of CubeSats or mini satellites. And that has enabled what you might call a democratization of space. It means that you don't have to be a big, large organization or to get in on the act. So we have things like the SmartSat CRC, which is a collaborative undertaking between academia and industry to do research into these. And government also is setting up projects to go and look at exploring the possibilities of what can be done with cheap, lightweight satellites to do sensing and communications. So as I say, we've moved from Australia being a consumer of space to very much becoming a producer in this space as well. Before we sort of move on, the other thing I'll point out is sort of a bit of the obvious, but actually Australia actually has a huge geographic advantage, a unique position in the world. You know, we're in a part of the world where a lot of other allied countries aren't around us, and situational awareness is actually very important from the space point of view, being able to see what's going on up there up in the sky. And we have a sensing station in Exmouth here in Western Australia, which is part of a Five Eyes network to do space situational awareness that uses radar and optical. The other thing as well as position is actually Australia actually has a huge amount of real estate. You know, that map you can see of Australia there from space. Population is really only around the edges of that, and there's large amounts of open space that can be used. So for example, we see over in Western Australia, the square kilometre array that's been set up, so a large scale array of antenna in order to do remote sensing. So these are, you know, some of the competitive advantages, apart from the know-how and the skill. The geographical location of Australia on the globe and its large landmass also give advantages to the industry here. So that's a little bit around space industry in Australia. Then go on to talk about cyber. And so I've been in Australia for about 9 years now. Those of you from the UK no doubt recognise my accent. I'm originally from the UK, but I moved out to Canberra back in 2011. And I have to say, Australians might not thank me for this, but when I first came here, I felt that actually probably Australia was not as mature, not as well advanced in terms of cybersecurity as the UK was. But what I've seen in the time here is that that gap has closed very rapidly. Australia has come along in leaps and bounds and is now starting to catch up with the situation in the UK and the US. And in some ways, actually, it's been world leading. Even if you cast our mind back to 2014, Australia at that time was a pioneer in setting up the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. So it was actually bringing together in one agency, one organisation, all those key people and key parts of government with responsibilities for cyberspace. And to sort of compare that, the NCSC in the UK, for example, was only set up a couple of years later. Of course, you could argue, although Australia sort of took the pioneering step of setting that up, it was maybe a bit slower in taking some of the next steps in terms of operationalising those functions and expanding the remit. That's something we've probably only seen in the last year or two, consolidating that. But in terms of setting up, certainly Australia was world leading. Two big steps that then came. So in 2016, Australia issued its cybersecurity strategy, and that covered a lot of things. And again, that was an expression of determination of Australia to be serious about cyberspace. It covered a lot of things, but actually one of the key messages I took out of that strategy was it recognised cybersecurity was both a risk, but also an opportunity for Australia, and one that needed to be grasped in order to improve Australia's position and Australia's prosperity and position in the world. What we've seen earlier on this year was the update of the 2020 cybersecurity strategy. Something that was actually, probably a year or more in the making, ended up being issued just as we were in the middle of a pandemic, but nonetheless a very important document and a very relevant document. And again, covered a large amount of areas, but the theme that I really picked out of that, and we'll come back to on this, is that what it really said is that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. It's not something that the government is going to do and the rest of the country is going to not have to worry about it. Cybersecurity is actually a shared endeavour. There are responsibilities on government, there are responsibilities on industry, and there are responsibilities on the public. So if we then sort of look, what about the intersection of cyber and space? Well, as Patricia's already said, cyber is a very attractive target to cyber attackers, people that would do harm, and that's for a number of reasons. So firstly, as Patricia said, it's critical infrastructure. It has been recognised that in some of the recent legislation and regulations from the Australian government as one of 9 or 10 sectors of critical infrastructure. But the other thing is that space is not only critical infrastructure in itself, it actually enables a number of other parts of our critical national infrastructure. And so you can say for most obvious example is telecommunications. As I say, a lot of telecommunications within Australia and from Australia to the rest of the world rely on satellite links. And therefore space actually is an important enabler to the telecommunications critical infrastructure that we have. What else is there? The other thing is that it's a high profile target. It's something that a lot of people have a lot of interest in now. It comes on the news every time there's a rocket launch or, Elon Musk has a SpaceX something. Everyone tunes in from around the world to watch that. And it also has the opportunity, particularly if you can go and interfere with some things, for example, a rocket launch, you could try and sabotage a satellite and send it crashing into Earth. There's a possibility for cyber attacks to not only have effects in the information domain, but to actually have effects in the physical domain. So for those attackers that are looking at publicity seeking, generating terror or attention, whatever for themselves, space is potentially a very attractive target for them. And the third reason that makes it an attractive target is geopolitical competition. As I said earlier on, space is a contested domain. A number of countries are there that are looking to actually make use of space for national advantage and geopolitical advantage. And therefore, sort of what we sometimes refer to as grey zone conflict between nations is also something that there's a potential to happen in space. So as we move into space and Australia starts to put capabilities out there in space that it builds, it needs to be aware that it's an attractive target for cyber attackers. The other thing about space actually is it's actually quite a difficult thing to defend. If we look at sort of traditional cyber security, for example, when I go and talk to customers sometimes about some of the most sensitive systems, I sound a bit heretical, but so I can ask them, does that really need to be connected? Or is actually that system so important, so great that the risks of connecting it up to other systems outweigh the benefits? That's not an option when you talk about space. If you're going to put something out in space, there's not much point in having it thousands of kilometers away unless you can communicate with it. Well, it's a nice piece of junk floating in the sky. So connectivity is not optional when it comes to space. The other thing about space is generally when we put things out there, they're around there for a long time. There are satellites out there that were launched 30, 40 years ago, which are still operational. And that means there's lots of legacy technology out there. And again, any cybersecurity expert will tell you one of the most difficult things to secure is legacy technology. Things that were designed and built before the sort of modern era of cyber attack and awareness of the risks are often some of the most vulnerable. And it's not as though you can, quite easily go out there and go and download a software patch to it or something like that. So we have a lot of legacy technology that's out there. And as we start to put new technology out in space, we need to be thinking about how it's going to be supportable and sustainable and continue to be secured against evolving threats for 30 or 40 years or longer. Another thing that makes space a vulnerable area is the fact that it requires lots of specialized components, lots of specialized things go together to put together an effective working space system. And what that means is we need diverse supply chains. No one company is going to be an expert at producing all those bits and pieces you need to put that system together. So that means we've got diverse supply chains. And the other thing it means is we actually end up with very complex systems, lots of moving parts. And again, from a cybersecurity point of view, complexity is a weakness because it creates what we call an attack surface. And what that really means is more different ways to attack someone. And ultimately, when you have a system with a number of potential ways in, it's only as strong as the weakest link in there. So if I could take an example of sort of, household security, your house might have good windows with locks on them, might have a good door with a strong lock on it, and you think you're well secured. But then you might decide that you've got a garage that you're going to build on the side, and you put one of those nice convenient openers so you can click a button in your car and the garage door opens. And then your garage has an intersecting door into your house. Suddenly, probably the weakest point of entry to your house is then that remote clicker interface. If someone can come and produce a clicker that mimics the signal from the one in your car, they can get access into your house. So that's an example there, you're as good as the weakest link. So when we've got complex systems with lots of parts that come from a wide range of suppliers, we need to have high levels of assurance in the security of all of those, because if one of them is not properly secured, that potentially compromises the whole system. So if I just sort of quickly pick up on an example there of some work I've been doing with a company here in Australia called Softel Systems, we were looking at telecommunication signaling protocols, and they're a complex area. You need to get a telecoms network to work, you've got to talk to other parties, you've got to interconnect to them. And if you look at complex scenarios and working with other people's legacy technologies, you realize there are lots of potential security risks that are not very well understood. This is an area that requires much more research. So talked about the risks. If we sort of go on and talk about the solutions, what can we do about this? Actually, earlier on today, an organisation called AusCyber was set up as part of that 2016 cybersecurity strategy to promote the Australian cyber industry. Said that actually the cyber industry in Australia generates about $3.6 billion of revenue and employs 26,000 people today. Those are impressive numbers, and even more impressive is an aim to grow that by 40% by 2024. And it's actually estimated that there's probably at least 40 companies in Australia that could provide solutions to help with this challenge of space and cybersecurity. It is a complicated problem to try and solve because there are lots of parts to it. And we often think about it in terms of 4 segments. We've got the user, so the person on the ground that's interacting with the system that may be sending data or receiving data or both. We tend to have a network of ground stations with which they communicate and then beam things up to space. We have the link, that's that RF link that goes out to the satellite out in space, and then that actual piece of equipment, the satellite that's out there in orbit. So it requires actually quite a complex systems viewpoint and that sort of end-to-end modeling and understanding. So again, an example of a company I've been working with, it's a good example of UK and Australia collaboration is Net Consulting. They have an experience of working in the UK in terms of understanding these complex communication networks and how you sort of stitch together services and secure those, and now doing that here in Australia. So it's a complicated problem, but I would also say, it's not all doom and gloom. if we look at the space industry, it is actually quite well set up to address a lot of these challenges. Because of this fact that, you know, things go out there up in space and they're there for decades, it's traditionally had very strong supply chain management. So, you know, if someone comes along and the manufacturer says, hold on, we had a dodgy batch of chips here, there need to be systems in place so you can work out where they've gone, where they might be deployed, and what might need to be replaced at some point. And it also has a very...
Rajiv, if I could give you a couple of minutes, please, Rajiv. Thanks.
Yeah, just wrapping up. Safety critical culture is also very, very well embedded there. But supply chain assurance is a very complicated problem. You know, it requires understanding and trusting the organization. It requires understanding and trusting that company and the data you give it. And it requires then being able to do some testing and assurance of the products that are out there. So we need to make sure we address all of that. So to sum up, you know, the question I was asked to answer is there sufficient awareness of these challenges? And the answer is probably okay, but the glass is, you know, half full or half empty, depending on your point of view, because that knowledge is fragmented. We do need some better research to try and confirm and understand that awareness. But I think what I would expect is there's a lot of awareness, if you like, but that's not being turned into action. And we need to make sure that it does get actively prioritized. As Patricia said, we've got to make sure we build security in from the start. There is the security of critical infrastructure regulations that Australia is bringing in here. Again, a sort of world-leading thing, but that will provide a positive security obligation. So it will help in incentivizing and making sure security is front of mind. So 2 thoughts to leave you with in terms of what we need to do. The first thing is I think we need to recognize this shared responsibility model, break down the silos and use both systems thinking as well as detailed technical expertise. And the second thing we need to do is we need to build an ecosystem and a network of trusted partners. We can build out trusted solutions and a trusted supply chain, because this is going to require a diverse range of capabilities and range of industry in order to be successful. So that I'll leave it there and look forward to a discussion and talking a bit more.
Well, thank you very much indeed to both of our doctors of science for those fantastic openers. If I'd just like to ask a question just to kick off, and I can see some questions coming in. So you know, from our viewers, which is great. Do you maybe in turn, Patricia, you know, is there sufficient awareness of the current cybersecurity challenges inside the space supply chain? You know, is there enough almost like instinct for cyber as people are building their systems and putting them together?
I think there's a growing awareness, David. I think that there's always a problem trade-off with cost versus security, and how much you spend on security versus how much it's worth doing, right? And I think that's true throughout industry. It's not special for space in that regard. So in cybersecurity, there's a saying which I think is absolutely right, and probably we should adopt it more widely, and that is that the point at which you feel secure is probably the point at which you're most insecure. So, you know, the moment you start getting complacent, that's the problem. And that's why I think we need to just think beyond cybersecurity, do what we can that is cost effective as far as we can ascertain. That's not always easy, but also be aware that that won't be enough and build in resilience. And I think that's a much better way of thinking about it. You have an awful lot of people telling you that they'll solve your cybersecurity problems. And yes, they'll solve a lot of them, but there's no such thing as 100%. So what you've got to do is recognize that, understand that, and just build in those resilient systems or resilient measures so that it doesn't matter too much if you didn't get 100%, or it's not the end of the world. And you know, if we think more about that in our security and provide this, you know, resilience as a form of deterrence type thing, it's not only a form of deterrence, it's a really sensible way of thinking. And particularly I think for space systems, because they are up there, apart from the LEOs, you know, most of them are up there for quite a long time. And so it is worth the investment in that regard. Now, there was another question about CubeSats and small sats. So I think this is perhaps a bigger problem in that, you know, the low cost of those satellites are, of course, one of the biggest parts of their attraction. And, you know, the low cost of sending them up. But there is also a resilience in numbers. So that's a way to think about it. There's a redundancy aspect. And I think that if we can go sort of deeper into the supply chain and across industry sort of build in this sense of responsibility for security deeper within the supply chain, then we might actually end up solving a lot of our problems throughout industry, not just in space.
Fantastic. Rajiv, on the same point, please. Awareness of the cybersecurity challenges inside the supply chains, which you've described. The Australian supply chains.
So
do you think there is enough at the moment? Yeah, sorry.
I think there's a basic awareness of the problems and the risks. I think what there isn't such a good awareness of is what you need to do about it. And Patricia made the point, and often you talk to people, even big organizations, they've gone and bought 20 different security products, but they don't necessarily do anything useful because each one is sort of like just sort of bought because it looks shiny and it sounds exciting without really thinking about what you need to do to address it. What you need to do is you need to have, what I would call defense in depth, similar to what Patricia is saying, which is that you start off by trying to design your system to be as secure. Look at what sort of risks you still have left, then you try and put in things to stop people getting in, if you like, those weak points. Then you put in a layer of sort of monitoring your system. So if someone gets past your defenses, then you spot them. And you must always have a plan in place about what are you going to do if the worst happens, because often it's a matter of when, not if. And so I think that sort of system level thinking is what's missing. And that's what we really need to encourage, is people trying to understand that systems level behavior rather than trying to do lots of point solutions, which I think at the moment is sort of where, people are trying to sort of stick the Band-Aid on.
Yep, I think that's a very strong point, because it's not just the satellites we're talking. We're talking about the the up and down links to satellites. We're talking the ground control infrastructure, the data centers, the computing power, and also the applications. Now, as you say, that we've got this democratization of space. It's how resilient are the applications on which people depend as well, and I think that's the whole vertically integrated stack. I'd just like to come back to Patricia, please, and maybe Rajiv can comment. Your term cross dependencies. What can you kind of explain, or illustrate what those cross dependencies might be, to almost to sort of, this is a wider problem, I think, is what you're trying to say.
Yes, I guess so. I suppose it's also, so let's take, for example, our NHS in the UK, very proud flagship National Health Service. And, it's been under a huge amount of pressure. It's had enormous amounts of cyber attacks, as you know, since the, going back years, but they've really ramped up since the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think if you talk with, people from NHS Digital, they have learned a huge amount. So they understand all of their systems. And when you talk with them about their dependencies on space, for example, I'm just using this, and I'm talking about not at the CEO level necessarily, but at the coalface level. And that's where, obviously, it really matters at the CEO level. I can't stress that enough, but we also need people who are at the working level to really get this. So we need it to be understood widely within each sector. So, if you talk to them about it, and, they can easily see their direct connections to space in terms of communications, in terms of electronics, etc. But then you start to factor in, for example, ambulance services, the emergency services. You start to factor in energy and the heating and the electricity, and you start to factor in water supply. And then perhaps you look at medicine supply and the supply chain in the whole pharmaceutical industry. You can do all those connections now quite quickly for yourself, just thinking about them. And then you realize that all of those have their dependencies on space. And so have they understood all of those dependencies and those cross dependencies? They may understand their own sector, and I think increasingly they do. And I'm just using the NHS as an example. I could have used any other. But they need to understand how they are dependent on other sectors too, and those dependencies, not only on space, but other things too. And that complexity of connectivity, which I think everyone in cybersecurity really understands, is not that well understood elsewhere. And my worry often is that we leave people behind in our thinking, that we assume that they understand this complexity, and they don't. And people get very confused, as you know, between complexity and being complicated, and they're two quite different things. So it's about understanding the true nature of connectivity.
Thanks, Patricia. Rajiv, you're on this wider picture of this rather sort of complex infrastructure which is now dependent on space. Any views there, please?
I think I'd probably just echo what Patricia said. It's about that complexity, and what we need to do is we need to be able to understand that complexity and model it. I'll just maybe pick up on one point, which is actually a lot of it does come down to leadership. As Patricia started saying, that it's important that CEOs get this. If CEOs get it and that flows down as a culture through the organization and through the workforce, that will then foster this awareness and this realization and this collaborative approach that we need. But that really requires leaders at the top of organizations to understand how interdependent they are and how potentially vulnerable they are, and for them to effectively work together and then flow that culture down through their organizations.
Yep, and I agree. Boardroom issue. Cyber is a boardroom issue. It's not for people in the basement, as it were. And I'm not wishing to denigrate our technologists, but maybe if people want to hang around for the event tomorrow, I can demonstrate what happens to companies that don't pay sufficient attention. Thank you for those two responses. We've got some questions here, which I'd like just to examine, maybe starting now with Rajiv. How secure do you think our current space assets really are, particularly those that might be 10 years plus old, when cyber wasn't such an issue as it is now?
I think the simple
and what do we do about it?
They are less secure than we would want them to be, or we would like them to be. It is a simple fact that something that was built 10 years ago, sent up there, probably hasn't been updated or modified since then, is actually vulnerable in a lot of ways. It's the same thing. If you've got, things like the NHS still having computers running Windows, deprecated versions of Windows. It's things like that. So, you'll have things up there that use very old version systems. They are a lot less secure. So what can we do about it? Actually then ends up thinking about, well, what do we build in terms of other safeguards around that? It's probably not practical to get someone to fly up there and go and patch the operating system. Very often these things have probably got, fairly low bandwidth links. It's not like we can remotely update them across the air. So then we start to think about how can we go and protect that? So, for example, how about if we make sure that those radio links that we have to communicate back and forth with that satellite are appropriately encrypted? And then the ground stations that are able to do that, making sure, for example, we put good physical access controls and only allowed certain people in there to get their hands on the equipment that can do that sort of thing. That's what we have to do, is we need to look at the fact that, okay, we might have this soft thing, if you like, in the center of our system that's that piece of technology that was built 10, 20 years ago and we can't really update, but what sort of guardrails can we build around that in order to secure it?
Thank you very much indeed, Rajiv. Patricia, any points on that? We're talking about older systems, which may, as you say, low Earth orbit sort of stuff. 10 years is probably ambitious, but I think we're talking geostationary and some of the sort of more heavy lift sort of communications and so on there.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what Raji said. I think we need to. I just think we need to recognize that the information we get may not be the information that we were meant to get. So we need to build in better authentication systems. So we've done that for signals. We understand how to do that with signals. Now we need to do it with digital. And that's obviously a bit harder, but it's not impossible. And there are checks and balances that you can build into systems. And maybe that, particularly with the legacy systems, that might be a very good place to place more focus.
Right, thanks very much indeed. We've got a point here, and I think it's an important point. It comes from an anonymous attendee. Does the nature of cybersecurity mean that cross-nation collaboration is difficult, and how do we overcome that? Both of you are from international policy institutes. I think, Patricia, you may have touched on some of this about how we, set international standards, for example, and so on. But it's more about the pace of cyber is very quick. How do we create an international mechanism where we aren't being left behind by the threats all the time, who are more agile and fast and so on? Have you any views on that, Patricia?
Yes, I have a lot.
It's about cross-nation collaboration, right?
Yeah, I do, David. I have a lot of strong views on this. So the answer is yes and no. Cross collaboration between countries can be very easy, particularly where these are allied countries. They're countries which depend on quite similar supply chains, quite similar infrastructure, and similar sort of philosophical approaches. Then, of course, between countries where it's completely different, the answer is no, it's not easy at all. So my view is that we don't wait to get full agreement across countries. Of course, we keep trying. Of course, we keep working within the United Nations, etc., to do that. But we develop multi-stakeholder, like-minded approaches to move ahead. And if you like, take the high ground and set the standards ourselves. Don't wait for the slowest players in this. And certainly don't be dragged down by those who actually have very different views and are using it for very different purposes. I think that in terms of the supply chain, you know, we ran, as everyone knows, a very public debate on the issue of 5G here in the UK, and the one of the suppliers, Huawei, in our infrastructure, our mobile infrastructure. And of course, you know, this was a really difficult debate because up until the COVID-19 pandemic, it was understood by people in the intelligence service, it wasn't full agreement, but that, you know, the Huawei is already part of the infrastructure in the UK and was manageable. We understood it. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't, perhaps, is the better phrase there. But as time went on and the politics with the United States and their relationship with China, it tipped the balance in the UK over the debate, and it was decided that over a period of time now, we have to transfer into different suppliers. This is a big wake-up call, I think, one that can be put to good use in terms of increasing cybersecurity in the supply chain and developing sets of standards, not only about kit and understood kit, because as you know, within Huawei kit, it's mostly about quality rather than anything else. But it's also about attitude, and we need to factor in behavioural aspects very much. And the UK is definitely, I know Australia is part of this, taking this line.
Thank you. International collaboration, Rajiv, is it you know, this is why we're here. We're trying to get this going. So, you know, what are the challenges that you think that we're going to have, apart from Sydney being, you know, 11 hours different from the United Kingdom now? What do you think those challenges in international collaboration are, particularly if we're starting to develop solutions, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, collaboration is going to be key here, because what we need to do is, you know, no one nation is going to be able to come up with all the solutions on its own. So what we need to do is we need to find trusted partners that we can work with. You know, Patricia brought up the example around 5G. You know, if you look at here in Australia, we were sort of one of the first places to decide to ban Huawei from the 5G network. But what we need to follow that up with is by, you know, working out what we're going to use instead and making sure that we have an ecosystem and a range of options of what we can do instead. And that involves working with other countries in order to build that ecosystem. And the same thing will apply in space. There are some, you know, I'll sort of maybe talk about some slightly different points, though I do agree with everything that Patricia said. But, you know, one of the things, though, is around the sort of technological challenges. You know, the time differences, we're 11 hours apart. You know, particularly in the current era, it's difficult to get physical interaction with the teams. So if you want to actually try and get, you know, those sort of close technology bits, it's difficult to get those teams working together. Therefore, what we need to actually try and do, in my view, is actually try and sort of subdivide the problem out, right? And say, well, here is one area that one nation is going to work on, but we need to have a really clear definition of the interface and how that fits into this system alongside things that another nation might be working with. So the two teams can go away and, you know, their experts can work on the things they're good at and bring them up. But we need to have a really good picture before we start of how we bring those two bits together and how they're going to interoperate and work together. And that's how we can start to address some of those, you know, physical challenges, very real challenges around time zone and distance.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong point. You know, identify the strengths and weaknesses between both parties here, and then sort of work. You know, where are the advantages in collaboration? And I think that's what we're going to be trying to start on day 3 at some of the you know, what needs to be done, now. And I think this is probably our last point. I do apologise to the others. I see that we got a number of you know. inputs from our audience, some of which will actually be quite happily addressed in the other two seminars. But this is about skills. Do the skills exist in the marketplace to deliver secure satellite systems, especially now we're launching so many small satellites around the world? And I think, this is an interesting point because, of course, cyber skills is a very hot market, because as realization or the cyber phenomenon continues to grow, it's a very competitive marketplace. So Patricia, is there sufficient skills in the marketplace? I'm also thinking, the small satellites. These are startup companies which are, just getting going. Having to spend money in, cybersecurity controls inside their growing enterprise. Just a minute on that, if I may.
Well, the answer, of course, is not, which is why we're spending so much of our time on building capacity in cybersecurity around the world. And I think that, one of the very neglected areas as a woman physicist myself is women in cyber. We have completely neglected 50% of our workforce, and we've turned it into this ridiculous situation. This is being rectified quite quickly, and in some countries the uptake of that is much better, but that's a very quick and easy win throughout many of our societies to increase the capability. Can I just please answer the very last question that came in about deterrence, resilience as a form of deterrence? Is it enough? No, of course not. Nothing's enough, but it's one part of the puzzle.
Thanks very much indeed. Rajiv, on that point there?
On the skills shortage, yeah, so this is actually a point I have
yes,
strong
exactly.
on, as well, if you were to do it quickly. But yes, there is a skill shortage, absolutely. I think what we need to do to address it, on top of making sure we draw on 100% of the population or to be potential parts of that workforce, the answer is not to go and send everyone off to go and do degrees in space cybersecurity, for example, right? The answer actually is to try and understand and find those people that have got some of those basic skills and the aptitude, and to get them trained up on the job, because in actual fact, I never did a degree in cybersecurity, but I'll guarantee if I did one 20 years ago, it would be completely irrelevant to what I'm trying to do now. So what we need is that finding people with the right skills and aptitudes. People today entering the workforce have got to realize they've got to be continuously learning new skills and new technologies and keeping their knowledge up to date. And having that mindset in our workforce, nurturing that from an early age through the education system, and then putting in place systems that allow people to do that sort of continuing education without having to step out of the workforce. Companies embracing on-the-job training and formal mentoring and things like that are the way we're going to address the skills challenge. When people talk about the fact we need to go and set up all these specialist degrees in this subject, I sort of that triggers me. But fortunately, you don't have time to hear me talk about that.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you. We're just up to time now, almost perfectly on time. I'm sorry to our attendees, we haven't got round. Some of the questions though will spill into the agenda for tomorrow and Wednesday. And so I'd like firstly to thank Patricia and Rajiv for those fascinating insights, essentially into the current situation. And then tomorrow at 0800 BST, the same time tomorrow, we're going to continue on to look at where do the responsibilities for the cybersecurity lie, and how should governments and industries work together to produce some of the risk mitigation in the space and cybersecurity conjunction. But thank you very much indeed, everyone, for attending today. It's a great scene setter. Once again, thank you to our presenters, and we look forward to the second event starting the same time tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.